Morning. It's Thursday, February 3rd, 9:01 a.m. This is meeting Senate Natural Resources and Energy. We are resuming our work on S-148, an act relating to environmental justice in Vermont. And we have guests back with us to help us continue editing and developing the bill. I also want to pause as we get going because I've worked with Jude our committee assistant in the last 24 hours on the schedule for the next 10 days. So just so that people have a sense of our pace, next week we'll be going to bill markup, and by the end of next week, beginning of the following, be looking to vote the bill out of committee. So roughly 10 days out from, just so that people have a sense of pace, we're gonna become editors as a group in the coming week. So with that, I'd like to turn it back over to you, Ms. Maholi, and you might remind us, we've sort of had the pendulum swinging back and forth between different groups of people who are all mutually interested in this. Maybe you could remind the committee and people watching where we last were when we worked on it and why you're back in today to help follow up on that last round of testimony.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good morning, senators. For the record, my name is Elena Maholi. I'm the Vice President and Director of Conservation Law Foundation, Vermont. So as a reminder of where you all have been, 2 weeks ago was the first time that this bill was kind of surfaced again since last session. And you heard from a number of guests who are closely tied to impacted communities in Vermont who have been touched by environmental justice issues. After that high-level introduction where I presented a PowerPoint on kind of what CLF and others in this working group that we've been working with see as best practices of what we would like to see in an environmental justice bill in Vermont. You also heard from the Agency of Natural Resources, their high-level interests in passing a bill. So as the chair noted, there's a lot of shared interest in getting an environmental justice bill passed in Vermont. And I would say largely, there's a lot of agreement. Over, I would say 95% of this bill, there's agreement on. And last week, you had an opportunity to get a walkthrough by Ms. Murkowski of the bill with amendments from the last time it was introduced. And you also heard from the Agency of Natural Resources with more granular level feedback on what I would say are like the 5% of the bill where they had some questions and wanted clarity in language. So my role today, I'm hoping to spend 1 minute reorienting you all to why are we even here talking about this? What is the problem? And then a minute on what does S-148, this bill before you, what does that do to actually tackle that problem? So I'm hoping to kind of just give you that big picture. And then what I've done is I've walked through the bill and I've actually, I've got red lines, but I can talk them through or I can share my screen. I think that may be nice to have a visual where I've actually modified the language to acknowledge some of the feedback that we heard from ANR and try to remediate any, most of their concerns. I understand that some we will still disagree on, and I think you're going to be hearing from the agency again tomorrow.
That is correct. So just so that people understand, ANR couldn't be here today, and our current witnesses, today was a much better day than tomorrow. So we're having to divide it a little bit, but
and thank you for accommodating that. And I think I want to be clear, we are in consultation with the agency. So what I'm presenting today comes to some degree out of 2 conversations that we've had with Deputy Secretary and the Commissioner, Commissioner Walk. So I still think it's important you hear from them, and I will share these red lines with them so that they can respond tomorrow. But I think we're heading towards pretty much almost alignment.
Okay, well, great. A little optimism never hurt anybody. I'm sure we'll find a way to get there.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear that you're engaged in your own. If we were in committee in the regular old way, I would be saying to you all, as you already have been doing, the more you can meet outside the committee time and come back with progress, that you've discussed things and find language that works for both parties, the better off we all are. So
well, and frankly, we've all been very accustomed to Zoom, so we're still able to do that to some degree. And so, yeah, I will highlight areas that I still think are places where we don't agree, but mostly what we've done is respond, and I think in a way that will be satisfactory.
Great. And I think when the time comes, yeah, please do screen share, because that ends up letting everyone see the same thing for sure.
Great. Then, yeah, Ms. Newman may just need to give me screen sharing capacity, but I will start off with just big
You already
picture.
have it. You have
Oh, great. Thank you. The problem is that in Vermont, Black, Indigenous people, people of color, and Vermonters living with low incomes are bearing more environmental harms and hazards like drinking water contamination or exposure to other toxins than white Vermonters. We know this to be true. These populations also tend to have less access to the very benefits that are intended to address those environmental harms, like investments in clean drinking water, like Superfund site cleanups, like investments in housing accommodations. So to summarize, these folks are being exposed to more harm, and then they have less access to the very investments that are designed to alleviate those harms. So what does S148 do? S148, the Environmental Justice Bill, sets forward a statewide policy that says that no segment of the population should, because of its racial or economic makeup, bear a disproportionate share of environmental burdens or be denied a proportionate share of environmental benefits. So essentially, this policy commits us to moving away from the status quo and achieving environmental justice. To begin this changing course and moving Vermont away from the status quo, the bill requires that state agencies and departments who are routinely involved in making decisions related to environmental protection and public health, they have to confront this reality of the fact that certain populations in Vermont are bearing more burdens and certain populations are getting better access to benefits. They have to confront this reality when they're making decisions about environmental and public health related projects and associated funding. That's what this bill requires them to do, to wrestle with that reality. Agencies and departments listed in this bill are those, like I said, that are most commonly making decisions around environmental issues. What they have to do, those agencies and departments, is consider the impacts on BIPOC and low-income Vermonters as they're making those decisions. And they will be informed by a number of things that the bill sets up. So the bill sets up a framework to assist agencies and departments in basically making this calculus when they're making decisions of how can we move away from the status quo. And there are 5 tools that the bill sets up to help them do that. The first is the bill sets up that ANR is going to create an environmental justice mapping tool. This is going to be a mapping tool that is a spatial analysis tool that has various data layers to visually display things like, where are Vermonters most exposed to environmental hazards? Where are the landfills located in Vermont? Is there flooding in Vermont? Underlying health factors. Where are the most Vermonters suffering from asthma, cardiovascular disease? And social factors as well. Where are Vermonters suffering the most from lack of food access, lack of public access to public transportation? That's what the EJ mapping tool will be. It will be a great tool for agencies and departments to be able to look to as they make decisions about where investments are going to be made in the community. Also, each agency and department listed in the bill must develop what's called a community engagement plan. This is a plan that will ensure meaningful participation of all individuals when they are making decisions. It's going to cover things like, who are they reaching out to? How are they reaching out to them? In what language are we reaching out to them? Third, ANR is going to adopt rules that provide guidance to agencies on how to consider what are called cumulative environmental impacts. And what this is referring to is that sometimes it's not just about this one project that's going into a community and what are the impacts of that one project. You have to also consider the layered on, what's called sometimes weathering of existing multiple environmental burdens that are already present in this community. Fourth, each agency and department has to conduct an inventory. Over the last 3 years, they have to do a look back of where have we been spending our investments, where have we been putting grant dollars and investing money within the state of Vermont. We have to assess whether we have been doing so in an equitable manner, or as the data shows us, are we putting more of those resources towards communities that maybe have higher capacity to apply for the grants, maybe have higher capacity to administer the grants. And as a result, how can we be shifting our practices so we make sure that we are more equitably distributing those funds related to environmental, energy, and public health related investments? What the bill does is it sets a target of spending 55% of state funds towards those very communities that, as we've identified in the status quo, are getting short shrift right now of our environmental benefits. The last thing that the bill does is it sets up an environmental justice advisory council that is a community member focused group that has lived experience and close community ties to Vermonters who are currently being overburdened and left out. And that advisory group has specific duties and is consulted on a number of occasions throughout the process of the state implementing this environmental justice policy. So that is a very high level overview of why we need this bill and how this bill goes about tackling this problem and starting to shift Vermont away from the status quo of making decisions in a way that disproportionately overburden certain populations.
Well, thank you. That was a very helpful to sort of step away from the bill and see the forest again before we go back in. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to entertain any questions at this point, or I can start sharing my screen and do a walkthrough of some of the changes that we made to the language.
Okay. And just logistically, is this something, so let's follow up and, for instance, can you send Jude and me the draft you have, if you haven't already done so?
I have not done so, but I can and will after this morning. And I will also share it with the Agency of Natural Resources so that they see it tomorrow. Great. Excuse me, they see it before tomorrow.
Right. I think they're planning on watching the streamed version of this of this episode of Senate Natural later.
Yes, that's true. Are you able to see this this in front of me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. So the first thing I wanted to address is I understand that Ms. Murkowski and Senator McCormick and you, Chair, had a conversation about findings last week and sort of whether or not this committee wants to include findings in the bill and the potential of that having some vulnerability when the bill goes to the floor. And I just wanted to say that these findings were drafted by the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School in consultation with UVM researchers. And what I have been working with them to do is, one, kind of shore them up so we get them down from 7 pages to less, and also provide a citations document so that each statement is cited to. There's the resource available, and so that it's very clear that these are grounded in fact and in data, and are not statements of opinion. So of course, it is up to your committee whether or not you choose to include findings, but I wanted to give the background on how these were drafted, and note that hopefully by the end of this week, you will get a kind of more tightened version that has a whole list of citations for each statement that is made.
Great. That was going to be one of my requests, is if we could have citations for each assertion there, that will be helpful. Thanks.
You got it. So I'm going to then scroll slowly all the way down to page 8, which is where you start with the definitions section. So the first definition is for something that is cumulative environmental burdens. This is what I was referring to earlier, which is that notion that sometimes a community has layered on environmental risks and hazards that all need to be considered at the same time, rather than piecemeal to ask whether a certain project would have a deleterious impact. This is a phrase that, for good reason, the Agency of Natural Resources wants to take their good time to flesh out and learn how to properly implement this. And what we ended up doing, and now that I'm sharing my screen, I'm just wanting to make sure that, because the version that I'm sharing doesn't have red lines. Hold on one second while I make sure I pull up the right version.
I'm familiar with this challenge when you have 7 tabs and 6 are versions of the same bill.
I know. I'm like, oh, I know why. Sorry. It's because I had to do it in Word. So I'm going to just stop sharing my screen and pull up the Word version. Okay. So let me scroll up. There we go. There are my nice red lines. So I'm going to scroll up back to definitions. Okay. Great. So some discussion last week was around this language that we were basically trying to define a definition in the statute, and then had language that ANR would be further defining it by rule. We acknowledge that that was confusing, and we've spoken to the agency about this, and so we suggest striking the part that would have them further define it by rule. Really what we wanted them to do was rule-make in order to figure out how to implement the process of doing a cumulative environmental burden assessment. So that's how we addressed that issue. The next definition that we changed, environmental burdens. Ms. Jakowski had raised, this is an awkward double negative right here. That is not insignificant. So we just struck it and said significant. We also heard ANR raise some concerns that we use the word fundamental right here, because that necessarily implies that there might be a legal action implied with that right being taken away, and we didn't want that to be confusing, so we struck fundamental right. We also included a little colon here, as Ms. Jakowski had suggested. This is better, it reads cleaner as a list. So we thought that having a colon here would kind of help cue the reader to the fact that this is a list of examples of environmental burdens.
Can I ask a quick question? So the term significant, I'm always just wondering, is there a legal standard for that? Or I'm just wondering how people know how to interpret the phrase significant.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the counter to de minimis. And that phrase is used a lot in statute and rule. And I think something that Ms. Murkowski, or maybe it was Commissioner Walk, was alluding to is like, we have a policy, an anti-degradation policy that allows for some de minimis harm of the environment. And so what this is acknowledging is that, I mean, and that could be a different phrasing, is non-de minimis instead of significant.
Sure.
But that's what this is trying to get at.
Okay, thank you.
The next definition that we made some changes to is in the environmental justice definition. Commissioner Walk had pointed out that there were some places where we used proportionate and some places we used equitable. So we tried to make changes throughout to be consistent. We also replaced environmental injustices with environmental burdens, since this environmental burdens is a defined term. So that was just a better word to use than a new term. The definition of environmental justice populations here, number 5, Ms. Murkowski had pointed out that this should really be the state annual median household income. So we took out wide. Also, I wanted to flag that there had been some discussion last week of the census block groups. And so as a reminder to the committee, there are 3 sizes of census measurements. The smallest one is a census block, and you can think of a neighborhood block. The medium size is a census block group. It's just a grouping of census blocks. And then the largest one is a census tract. And the reason why this definition uses census block group is because that's really a sweet spot. It's the middle measurement that gets us granular enough where we can talk about household level, but the data exists at that level that is reliable to be generating spatial analysis mapping. A lot of times, if you go all the way down to just the block level, we don't have the demographic data to even map that out. So that's why we've used census block group. It is that middle sweet spot. Next, meaningful participation. Did you have a question, Chair?
Yes, please. Can you remind the committee again about how these thresholds of 80% on income and 6% on people of color and indigenous peoples comprise at least 6%, and then 1% limited English proficiency?
Yes, those are thresholds that were chosen based on the the state average. Okay. So the state average, people of color, including indigenous peoples, is 6%. So essentially think about it as these are the areas where you have a concentration higher than state average of these people. Same with limited English proficiency. Statewide average is 1%. So this identifies areas where there's a concentration of people with limited English proficiency. And then the number for low income is tied, it tracks the Housing and Urban Development federal agencies definition for low income for who is eligible for assisted housing. And so as a reminder, if you hearken back to the PowerPoint presentation I gave 3 weeks ago, which you have access to on your website, we did generate a map to just gut check these threshold figures, and it adds up to 52% of Vermont's population satisfies these thresholds. And we also distributed that map around and consulted with many Vermonters who are more closely tied and working on the ground with these populations, and it checked out.
Great, thank you.
Sure. So meaningful participation, again, we heard some consternation from ANR about having the word right in here, as in that may be generating some legal right that could be enforced, and that's not the intention. So we struck that. And finally, in the definition section, this term overburdened and underserved community is used throughout the bill. And so at first we thought it would be helpful to define it, but as you can see, the way that we defined it was basically punting and saying that it will be defined by ANR based on these things. And we heard from ANR and understand that it doesn't really make sense to have a definition in statute that says that the agency will define it by rule. So with consultation with the agency, we struck this definition, and this will be something that is further provided guidance on this definition of what this means through agency rulemaking. Okay, so I'm through the definition section and onto the meat of the bill, which is the environmental justice policy. Section A, if you recall, when Ms. Murkowski was walking through it, there was a question, I believe, Chair Bray, you raised of, is this policy where we say no portion of this, no segment of the state population is going to suffer a disproportionate burden? How is that connected to Title VI of the Federal Civil Rights Act? And she responded correctly that this is distinct from Title VI. This is, it helps any state that is affirmatively taking action to fight environmental injustices. That will help alleviate disparate impact discrimination and assist promoting Title VI compliance. But it's also really important in its own right, and it is distinct. So I just want to be clear that Section A that sets out really the policy of the state, that's different than Title VI compliance. It's not as though if you comply with Section sub A, then you've checked all your Title VI boxes. So I just wanted to make that clear.
Right. So are you saying, in essence, it's Vermont affirming for itself this policy?
Yes.
On its own,
yeah.
Even though there are compliance requirements related to Title VI.
Yes, and by making this a policy, it is assisting us in complying with Title VI. Uh-huh. But this is really the policy that the Climate Action Plan was referring to when it said that we need an environmental justice policy. That is what this is, this little subpart A here. As a reminder, I was saying at the beginning that this obligation of agencies to really wrestle with, as they're making decisions, who is suffering from environmental harms more, who is getting more of the benefits. This is the list of the agencies that we've identified that most frequently deal with environmental, energy, public health related decisions. And this has been a grouping that ANR has been working with us on, and we've heard feedback from other stakeholders in the last week of other entities that should be included that may have been left out. And ANR suggested including the Natural Resources Board in here, so that has been added. They also recommended including the Public Utilities Commission, but as far as I know, they would necessarily be included because they operate under the Department of Public Service, but that may be something that you look into further.
Right. Thanks for mentioning that one. I actually got a note from TJ Poor at the department, and he's scheduled to come in and talk with us tomorrow a little bit about that nexus.
Oh, great. Perfect. I will note that whatever changes you make to this section of which agencies and departments are subject to the requirements here, then you want to mirror that in the rulemaking section of giving those agencies authority to rulemaking to implement the chapter. The next piece of the policy, subpart B and C are really related to community engagement plans, and I do not believe that there is much tension at all in these sections. And so I'm skipping over to D, which I do know there is still friction around. We have it in here as a shall, as a target. And I think the agency has proposed this be a goal. We believe that 55% is, well, first of all, let me back up and just speak to the rationale. Like why include this? As it currently stands, you know, a lot of people will note that we need to improve access to grant programs for all communities, that the current situation creates a kind of Hunger Games scenario where those communities that have the most capacity to succeed often tend to succeed. And those communities with less capacity tend to produce less competitive applications or don't apply at all. And for some, they don't even have the capacity to administer the grant. So there are a lot of negative impacts of this in that it just creates an inequitable situation where state dollars tend to be going more to certain communities than others. So we're trying to shake that up and to create a policy at the state level that we really have to be more mindful and we have to be intentional about where state investments are going and make sure that we are being equitable about it. And so the fact that this provision says basically 55% of these types of investments, environmental, renewable energy, transportation, they have to go to either environmental justice populations, as it's defined in the bill, or overburdened and underserved communities, which, as I alluded to earlier, is not defined in statute. That is something that ANR is going to help flesh out in rule. This is a broad swath of Vermont, and therefore we believe this is a highly attainable figure, and the agency has a year and a half to get there. So we think this is fair to leave it as a target. But I am noting that that's a point of dispute.
Okay, thank you.
Moving on, we changed funds to investments here. That was a request of ANR that we agreed to do to make it clearer. If there's questions from the committee on the types of projects that this would cover, I highly recommend there is a guidance document that I could attach when I send these red lines. I can send a copy of. It's federal guidance for how the Justice 40 initiative is working at the federal level and the types of investments that would count under that program to be included. Like, what is an environmental investment? What is a renewable energy investment? A climate mitigation investment? It has examples of all of that. So I can include that for the committee to review.
Yes, please. So we'll put up in our materials for today your red line plus the guidance document. Thanks.
Great. I also just wanted to clarify this last sentence because I think there was some question around what it meant. And this was just intended to protect those grant programs that already have language in them intended to help support certain minority populations, underserved populations in Vermont. We didn't want this policy to disrupt existing terrific programs that already are targeted to go to low and moderate income Vermonters. And this was partly in conversation with organizations that administer those grants. They wanted this kind of protective language. Finally, in G here, we cut and paste. There's a requirement that, well, we acknowledge that the environmental justice population definition that we came up with in this bill should be revisited. that is best practice, and what other states are doing in their environmental justice bills is setting up 5-year review periods. And Commissioner Walk rightly pointed out, this was in the rulemaking section and it didn't make sense to be there. So we pulled it out and put it under the environmental justice policy.
Okay.
Next, we get to the rulemaking section. We heard from the agency that they wanted more time to make sure that this rule around how to do a cumulative environmental burden analysis, how they would carry that out. They wanted time to rule make on that, and we hear them. And in consultation with them, we suggest moving this from 1 year to 18 months. And I believe that they will agree to that. It is a compromise point that I think hopefully we can work with. Okay. We also included the word iterative in front of consultation. This is from the Washington environmental justice law. They use this phrasing, and we really liked it because it helps embody the spirit of consultation being a iterative process, and that you can't just check the box once by going to an agency and saying, or going to an advisory council and saying, what do you think once, but that it is an iterative process. So we thought this was really good language, so we included it throughout. This is struck because, as I noted in the definition section for cumulative environmental burdens, it does not make sense for ANR to further define it in rule. It is now defined in statute, so you don't need this define language. We also added the Natural Resources Board. As I discussed earlier, this rulemaking section has to mirror the agencies and departments that you list in the policy, so we added them to it. That was, again, at the request of ANR. Moving down to D. This is where we have given the Advisory Council on Environmental Justice the opportunity to approve rules by vote. And as Ms. Chakowski pointed out, it was rather awkward saying 25% disagree. Instead, we changed it to supermajority vote. This is a new process. This is unique, and I think this bill warrants a unique process. Of all advisory councils that we have in this state, if we're going to create one that is around environmental justice and meaningful participation and engagement, we have heard feedback from countless voices that this body needs to actually have the power to meaningfully influence outcomes. And I think that there's no patience for setting up another advisory group. I think there's even resentment that it would be called an advisory group, but no one wants to set up another group whose advice goes into a vacuum and does not have to be actually listened to. So what this is trying to do is set up a system, and I will say, this is how Massachusetts environmental justice law is framed. They have an EJ advisory council, and any rule, before it is put out for public comment, has to go through that council and be approved by majority vote. So it may be new to Vermont, but it is existing in Massachusetts law, and we think is a valid demonstration of empowering this body. Now, I know that Chair Bray and Senator McDonald, you are both serving on LCAR, and asked whether this would interface with that at all, and I do not think that it would. This is a process that would happen before the rule even was sent to ICAR, and given your limited jurisdictional review, this is stuff that would happen prior to LCAR. So I will note this is a point of friction, and the agency has not agreed that they can support this. So that is a place I would also highlight as, you know, a decision for you all to make. And I'll just leave it by saying we added, you know, another provision that is worth considering as a way to ensure the meaningful engagement of this advisory group is that they would have access to review public comments as they're coming in on rules at the same time as the agency, so that they can help be involved in sorting through those. Because as you know, right now, the way that that public comment process works is the agency just collects all of those public comments. And then only when they issue the final rule do you get to see all the comments and see their responses to it. So this last highlighted section is basically saying, hey, let the advisory group in on the process of being able to review those public comments as they're coming in, so that they can actually be advising, giving advice on how to navigate those public comments.
And
so yep, go ahead.
Yeah, just so I understand the process, are these, I'm just trying to figure out if the last section we just talked about there, that last sentence, if that feedback is after the advisory council has already approved a rule to move forward. Now, is this in like sort of the publishing phase of a rule, and then additional public comments come in? You know, so what I'm saying in a way is, if the advisory council has had a supermajority, affirmative supermajority vote, now they've gone on, they've published the rule, they're collecting public comments, does the advisory council have an ability to then say, we didn't consider this particular thing that public comment raised, and then do they have any recourse at that point? Or are you saying, no, they've already approved it, it's moved forward, now it's in sort of a more traditional rulemaking posture, and it's up to the agency to be responsive, and
yeah, there's no additional hook by which the agency would have to listen to the advisory council in that late stage. I think it would just be that the agency is directed to consult with the advisory council throughout the rulemaking process. And so in terms of issuing a formal rule, that is something they would have to consult around.
Okay. And the rule, as it comes before it's sent to ICAR, has to be approved by a supermajority. And if not approved, then it says the relevant agency must reconsider the proposed rule, prepare a revision that responds to member concerns. So I suppose the test there is whether or not they've been responsive enough will be the subsequent votes by the council.
That's right.
Okay. Thank you.
So because I remember you last time saying, like, how do you avoid getting stuck in a like circle of votes? But frankly, that's an iterative process, and like, it's not a bad thing to be in a process of getting input and working together to come to a draft that feels good to the majority of the advisory group.
Okay. Do we define supermajority anywhere here?
No. If that needs defining, that could be just probably defined in this sentence.
Yeah.
I think.
I just wanted to check. I don't know if it's implicit that it's 75%.
Yeah, I think probably Ms. Chakowski could be the one to answer that question best, yeah, in terms of how laws, whether they go with an implicit definition or make it explicit.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, moving on to this section, which is where we talk about the advisory council. Up until now, I've been talking about just one, the Environmental Justice Advisory Council. But you'll see here, there is also an interagency council on environmental justice. Why? We heard feedback that this was a scenario where it probably made best sense to actually have one interagency kind of working group that is made up of agency officials and representatives that would be in charge of coordinating implementation of this environmental justice policy at the state level and are making sure that everyone's moving ahead in lockstep. That is different from a community member focused group that is made up of people with lived experience and close community ties on the ground, that is tapped for advice coming from, like, sourced by the community. And even A&R had raised concerns when we initially shared the draft with them that just had one council with both members, that it really didn't make sense to have a mixed body like that. So we separated them out. And this is actually how Massachusetts environmental justice law that just passed last year is framed as well. There is an interagency working group, and then there's a separate advisory council. So in this section, the changes that we made related to acknowledging in the frequency of meetings. I think it was pointed out by Agency of Natural Resources to us, and we agree that these groups are going to need to meet probably monthly, and that it was unrealistic to have 4 as the minimum. So we upped it to 9, and they can always meet more, but this is a minimum set in statute. In terms of the duties, one of the duties that both of the councils have jointly is to review the definition of environmental justice populations. We acknowledge that the statutory definition we chose that I walked you through, that has to do with 6% people of color, 1% limited English proficiency, those are based on demographic factors. There are a host of other factors that one can consider in asking who in the state should be best protected by this law. And so one of the tasks that both of these councils are going to do is actually revisit the definition of environmental justice populations and ask, should it have additional criteria besides just race, limited English proficiency, and income? So that is one of their first tasks. And what Commissioner Walk rightly pointed out last week is that it really doesn't make sense to limit that revision process by telling them the factors that they have to consider. So we cut out this provision right here that gave instructions because it limited what they could review. I think this is intended to be a process that is expansive and lets them think about other factors. So we removed that. In terms of the duties of the advisory council, there was also concern by A&R's lawyers around E, which is where we were giving them the ability to review Title VI complaints. As a reminder, Title VI is the Federal Civil Rights Act, and any individual can submit a complaint saying that they were discriminated against and it is a violation of their rights under Title VI. And we did not mean to be implying that the advisory council would be reviewing those very specific complaints and telling the agency how they should resolve them. That would be confusing. What we meant to say is that they are reviewing annual state agency summaries of the complaints, and then they have the opportunity to suggest options or alternatives for not resolving the complaint itself, but resolving systemic issues that are raised in or by the complaints. So we tried to clarify that duty in response to A&R's feedback. Membership of the advisory council. We heard Ms. Murkowski say that significant was vague, so we specified that it means more than 50% of this advisory council reside in a designated environmental justice population. We changed this from 15 to 17 to account for adding the two bodies that I'll get down to later. One question that I have, but I didn't make a red line, is whether the director of racial equity should actually be in the interagency working group as opposed to the like community member advisory group. And that may be a question for ANR to talk about tomorrow, their thoughts on that. There was also a question around this sentence. It was Commissioner Walk said that it's a little bit unclear what a community affected by environmental justice concerns means. So we clarified this to say, this really is saying two representatives who reside in a census block group that is designated as an environmental justice population. Going down to membership, we were contacted by the executive director of the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board with a request to be included in this advisory council, and we agree this makes sense. That is a group that works at the interface of environmental justice matters in Vermont and could be a good liaison in their nonprofit quasi-governmental capacity to serve on this advisory council. Same thing with the chair of the Natural Resources Conservation Council. This is the conservation district's overarching agency, and their main purpose is distributing resources and public participation in natural resource policy through local working groups. So they're a very apt group to include on this. And Ms. Byrne, who is with you here today, is very familiar and works for the Natural Resources Conservation District. And so she can speak to that more if you would like.
Okay, thank you.
Moving down, the membership of the Interagency Council. As a reminder, this is the one that has government officials on it. We, at the request of ANR, added 2 members to this, so moved it up to 11. And that would be the chair of the Public Utilities Commission and the chair of the Natural Resources Board. We're getting close. We also heard from Ms. Murkowski that in terms of the term limits, this was a little awkward because it had 2, 3, 6, and it made more sense to have 2, 4, 6. This was just a typo. So I corrected it to be 4. These 6-year terms were actually recommended by EPA rather than 3-year terms in EPA, in the agency's experience, particularly for issues around community engagement. It's so much about relationships that it's really important to give people time to actually get to know one another and work together. And so having longer term limits actually helps engender those relationships and foster those relationships. So this was, at the agency's request that we change this to 6. And this was just, we forgot to change this to 4. I think the last section is the environmental justice mapping tool, which I was saying is a tool that ANR is going to create to help other agencies make decisions so that we move away from the status quo. And we heard feedback from our working group that this was another great opportunity to make sure that the advisory council is looped into the process of developing this tool, because we really want this tool to not only be a resource for agencies, but also a resource for communities. Similar to the Natural Resources Atlas, that is a tool that can be used and is used by many people in the community to figure out what's around them, what's happening near them, where is, where are the stormwater or combined sewer overflows in their neighborhood. We want this map to be useful to community members. And so we included that ANR will provide monthly updates to the Advisory Council on Environmental Justice as it develops the mapping tool to solicit input and advice. Now, the only other large section that I really think is important to highlight for the committee is this funding section, which currently just has a placeholder. And I know that the Agency of Natural Resources is pretty concerned that a lot of the requests and the burdens on them, not burdens, but the responsibilities that they are ready to take related to this bill are going to cost. And we support seeking funding to allow ANR to succeed in their lead role in helping implement this policy and staffing the Advisory Council. And so I just want to assert our support for trying to find funding that is associated with this bill.
Okay. Great. And on that, I've asked Commissioner Walk to consider the funding implications of the bill, and it's roughly in its current stage. So we don't know exactly what it will look like, but because I don't think we haven't discussed any kind of even ballpark figures. So I'm hopeful that he may have some preliminary numbers to share with us tomorrow when he's in.
Great. So that concludes my walkthrough of sections of the bill, and I am more than happy to take questions.
Sure. Why don't we, for the time being, stop screen sharing so we can see each other better.
Great.
If we need to go back to the bill, then you're adept at screen sharing. We'll zoom back there.
Don't overpromise.
Yeah. Senator McCormick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question, but I want to establish the context first. Susanna Davis is our state racial equity officer, and she says that frequently she's confronted by a white person who will say, I'm white and I'm disadvantaged too. What about me? And her answer, I think, makes good sense. She said, you may indeed be white and disadvantaged, but you're not disadvantaged because you're white. So I acknowledge that the racial makeup of people who are impacted by environmental problems is relevant. But what do we do about when we map where the environmental problems are and we find low-income, disadvantaged white people in some of those areas? Thinking Hurricane Irene knocked out a trailer park in Woodstock. I think they were all white and they were there because they were poor. How do we answer that complaint?
So that is why we included income in the definition of an environmental justice population. So and I'm happy to share the maps again. I don't have them pulled up, but essentially we mapped out, okay, where in the state are the census block groups that light up, if you will, if you put in 6% or more of the population are people of color. Similarly, where are the states in the state that light up if you look at language limited English proficiency? And then we said, where are the parts of the state that light up when you look at just low income status? And essentially much of the Northeast Kingdom and parts of Southwest Vermont. And so that is rolled into the definition of environmental justice populations. And those folks, sometimes white low-income Vermonters, are going to be included and protected by the provisions in this bill.
I'm sure I could have answered that for myself by reading the text more carefully. And it was probably in your testimony already, but we're dealing with we're keeping a lot of balls in the air at the same time. So I've been looking for the bold strokes on this bill so far. So thank you for that. That's exactly what I was hoping to hear. Thank you.
Great.
And I can ask Jude if she can send the maps back out to committee members, just so that in an email today, so you can take a look, and it's helpful. There's 4 versions. There are all the criteria applied to a single map, so you see sort of the superset, but then there's 3 that go criterion by criterion, so you can see the relationship between all of them and how they then work cumulatively together. So it's helpful to see that it's, I think people may be surprised to see the extent of the areas that quote unquote light up.
And to be clear, those maps we generated in-house as a means to kind of gut check the thresholds that we had chosen to define these populations. Those maps are very different than what we are proposing ANR creates, which is an environmental justice mapping tool that has multiple layers, that is not just demographic, but also where are the landfills, where do people have asthma, that kind of stuff.
Okay, thanks for that. Do you, Ms. Maholi, have any sense of the budget from looking at other states? Like you've mentioned Massachusetts a number of times. I know that funding, we'll hear from the agency, but I don't have even sort of a ballpark figure for how a program like this gets stood up and funded. So it's not your job, but I'm just wondering if you have any data to share. Okay.
I'm not prepared today to speak to any of that, but it's certainly something, I mean, because we were deferring to our agency to develop that information. We don't presuppose to know what exactly they need, but certainly that's something I can look into, and perhaps Ms. Byrne, when she testifies, I know she's been familiarizing herself with the Washington HEAL Act and other laws, so she may have a response on that, but it's not something I can speak to at this point, other than to say that funding is imperative and very important to like standing these up, as you say.
Sure. Okay. And it may be for you, or maybe Ms. Byrne can get to it. I'm also just thinking about the, and again, we don't need to be nailing this down, but I'm trying to think creatively in anticipation of funding streams. It might be that there are federal funds that are naturally available to do this kind of work, or impact fees may have been assessed as a way of funding the work. I'm not sure how people are funding it, but be interesting to see other models from people who are have already done this work in their states. So
yeah, and my understanding is that Secretary Gendron has been meeting with other states over the course of the last week and asking that very question of how are you funding this? So I think that she will have some thoughts for you tomorrow.
All right. Well, now you've created a teaser for us, so we'll all be
hopefully
tuning in.
I'm not over promising on what she's planning on talking about, but you know, I think they are quite focused on that right now, because they want to do this well, genuinely, everyone over there, and so I think they know that that is going to require capacity,
right, and it's a steady long-term effort. So
that's right. That's right.
That's always one of our challenges is sometimes we scramble to find money to stand something up and launch it, but we need to sustain things in order to have them really be functional. So.
Yeah, and I think it's worth reiterating that this bill, as we talked about before, really is setting up a framework. And we hope that the state will move further in the direction of having more concrete protections for environmental justice populations in the future. And this really sets up the paradigm under which those things will be able to happen more easily. Now that we will have an environmental justice policy, now that we'll have these councils, now that we'll have an EJ mapping tool, now that we'll have rules around cumulative burdens, you know, we're working towards a long-term effort to protect all Vermonters from environmental injustices.
Great. Well, thank you. Are there any committee questions for Ms. Maholi? Okay, or the red line? If not, I'd like to turn to Ms. Byrne. Thank you for coming back again. So if you can remind the committee, it's fine. You've told us before, but maybe you can help us remember for sure. You've been looking at how this kind of work has been carrying. You're basically inventorying what's going on a national level. So you have access to a lot of models. Is that right?
Yes, to an extent. And I'll just introduce myself for the record. My name is Jennifer Byrne. I am a fellow in the Environmental Justice Clinic at Vermont Law School. I'm not an attorney. My background, I have a master's in environmental law and policy, and for the past 5 years have been doing some amount of research into other states' environmental justice law and policies. The EJ Clinic itself is conducting a 50-state survey of all environmental justice laws and policies, which will probably go live this spring as a database. And so, yeah, I have a lot of the background research for that. And today, and I'm not going to speak for too long. I want to be here as a resource as you discuss. And if you have any questions or context specifically for this bill, too, I've been involved since the beginning of the drafting. So if there's any question on intent or why things are included, I'm happy to be here as you discuss.
Okay.
And but I will say just a few things, especially picking up on that funding conversation. Two things jump out to me as really important based on our conversations of this past week with our partners and with ANR. One being, that this level of community engagement and the need for an environmental justice policy is included in the climate action plan. So this is a perfect place for funding, especially, some of the ARPA funding to be plugged in here. And on top of that, I was sort of recently became aware that the ANR's civil rights officer is actually part-time. And because we are engaged with them, I see the type of work and the level of work that she's doing, and that's not a part-time job by any stretch. And so for that, to be made full-time in 2022, it's also my understanding that the recent budget request was for that to be made full-time in 2023. I think it's really important that we consider making that a full-time position as soon as possible and using some funding for that. The other piece of
pardon me. Can you say what was the name of the position at
the
ANR?
civil rights officer?
Thank you. Which is part-time now, and you're urging it to become full-time now rather than wait for FY23.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yes, and then the last piece, as far as making sure there is enough funding, for the advisory council to meet not only this minimum of 9 times, they very well may meet more than that. And then we're also seeing in other states, like in Washington, the advisory council is setting up subcommittees and are meeting a lot more frequently to really get it off the ground and establish the norms and do some really meaningful work. So having enough budget for the advisory council to meet, I even though the stipends are small,
Right.
We want to be sure that they're able to do that.
Sure. Can follow up on that for a moment. So I think the normal daily stipend on the state for a meeting is $50, I believe. Does that sound right? I should know that number for sure, but
That sounds right. Yeah.
the current number, so very modest, and particularly if you consider that anyone who's really going to a meeting to fully participate has probably spent 2 or 3 times as much time as the meeting time to be well prepared to participate. So it's like if you're meeting for a day, you might prepare for a day or two, and we don't really have a way of addressing that investment in time. I know I've talked with some people who are on the climate action, the Vermont Climate Council, who were drawn to the work, participated fully, but found it very difficult because they were torn between making a living and participating at the level that they felt was called for. Have you seen models that address something that helps support participants beyond just $50 for the day that you actually came to the meeting?
Right. Yes, and that's, I'm reminded of something Kaya Morris said in her testimony a couple of weeks ago, that this is really going to be hinging on public-private partnership. And thankfully, we have there is groundwork for that in the state, in Vermont already, because we're building this environmental justice network where we have some amount of resources to begin to compensate liaisons, community liaisons, that we're hopeful, if it's completely up to the individual, if they were to be included as a network member, or a community liaison within the environmental justice network, they can have access to additional funds through that. So we're hoping that by resourcing them outside of the work on the advisory council, that is a way to compensate them for their effort and all the background knowledge and the lived experience, the expertise that they're bringing. So within the state, that this is what we're hopeful for here, as far as compensating people and kind of getting around that really limited funding for their time on the working group or the advisory council.
I don't want to guess. Let me ask. I get the sense that it's not just the money in terms of time spent, because I'm sure everyone who's doing this kind of work already volunteers a lot of time, and there's many people who volunteer all sorts of time. Is this also in a way a proxy for respect, a codification of respect for that contribution?
It's an attempt at that, yes. And that's also, I heard last week, there was a little bit of question around the wording within the statute regarding the advisory council creating an equitable dynamic, is the phrase in the legislation. And, again, that's an attempt at that respect. It's really just an intent and it's just language. But we do specifically point to the guidance put out by the Just Transition Subcommittee. And so, giving, it's also a really good reason for bifurcating the advisory council into an interagency and then an EJ advisory council to create an affinity space for folks where they have more ability to lead and create the norms of that council, and meeting times, for instance, and location, and being a little more flexible there.
Yeah. When we talk about public-private partnerships, is that, are you thinking of things along the lines, or have you seen examples along the lines where major funders, foundations, for instance, have seen the importance of this work and sort of created a fund to provide that level of support? Is that something you're considering or have seen? I know we can't count on that in here, but I'm just wondering if it's something you've seen.
I can't say whether that's the case in other states. I don't know. Elena mentioned Maggie Gendron is really doing kind of a survey of these other states and having conversations with folks from Washington and Massachusetts. And so she specifically about the advisory council and how it's been rolling out. So she'll have really great information on that from an agency viewpoint. Yeah. And that is certainly, though, what we're hoping for. We do have funding already. We have a grant from the EPA to fund the EJ network. We have a grant or a contract with the DEC to fund community engagement by providing stipends to participants for their engagement. So there is already precedent in the state with state agencies, providing that stipend in order to, build in a little bit of respect. It's really a token, right. But it's something.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you. I don't want to get hung up on money. At some point, it always becomes important, but I don't want it to be the only thing. So I don't know if you have other things you wanted to share with the committee while you're with us this morning.
I guess really briefly, I'll share this. I'm not sure. Oh, I'll need to get access to share my screen. If you could do that. I just have the 2 pages of a comparison. There was in A&R's testimony last week, they brought up the difference or the comparison to Washington's definition for environmental harm. They don't use the phrase environmental burden. So I just wanted to put this up here. If you want to just look at it, I'm not sure if it's helpful for me to read it, but the two definitions from Washington and Massachusetts, and you'll see that S148 really mimics the Massachusetts definition. I wanted to, just give this to you as an example.
Okay, sure.
And then above, I can send this. And then above, I also have in Washington, I think one other thing that seems to be happening in some conversation is conflating environmental justice policy with Title VI. And just to be really clear, environmental justice is the goal of equitable distribution of environmental burdens and benefits. And Title VI is really this baseline, civil rights requirement. And I think it made more clear in the HEAL Act from Washington, which I have here. This is their mandate for community engagement. And it really describes community engagement planning and sort of the emphasis on prioritizing overburdened communities. And then I highlighted here how they reference Title VI. And then I'll scroll down a little bit. This is the 148 equivalent. And so just to be clear, Title VI as this baseline procedural method for engagement that we know is necessary as a very necessary baseline to stand on in order to achieve environmental justice. And the policy goes even further to demand that equitable distribution of burdens and benefits.
Okay, so well, thank you for those examples. And yeah, if you could send them to Jude, she'll put them on our committee page, and I'll ask her to email them off to committee members as well. There was one there that you didn't note, and it was using plain language. I noticed that one.
Yeah, that's a Washington state executive order. I think it's interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
Senator McCormick.
Thanks. Just very briefly, I just want to say I too have my master's degree in environmental law from the Vermont Law School. And It's good to see an alumna.
Nice. Go Swans.
Yeah. I've got another bill in another committee dealing with school mascots. And our school mascot is the Swans.
The Fighting Swans.
A swan. Yes, we are swans.
All right. Any committee questions for Ms. Byrne? All right. So thank you very much for sharing that and sending it along. And we'll we have the red line now, which is also helpful since we're in markup phase, and we'll have the agency in tomorrow get a response to your markup. And I'm sure they also hear our conversation today about funding as we start to tackle that section, which we haven't talked about really very much at all so far. And I think we're actually running a little ahead of schedule, which is okay. I don't think anyone will mind. So if there's no committee questions or discussion that people want to have right at the moment, I would say we would take our break early, and that means it's 10:20, and we'll come back at 10:50. So half hour, and we'll just shift it forward 10 minutes. Okay, so see you at 10:50.